If you think back to the beginning of this course, you may remember your first encounter with a philosophical article. You likely had some rather negative thoughts towards it. Indeed, you probably thought something like, I don't think these ideas make any sense whatsoever, or perhaps, I really think this guy might just be crazy. Or perhaps you even thought, that's it, I'm dropping this class. I mention this because I react in much the same way upon reading A.J. Ayer's critique of ethics. Indeed, Ayer strikes me as completely confusing, sometimes unreasonable, and almost all the time misguided. I therefore must apologize if my portrayal of him is inaccurate or confusing. I can assure you this is no reflection upon Ayer, but rather upon me. However, you still might reasonably ask me, if you don't understand Ayer, then why are we reading him? It is a good question. The only answer I can give is that I feel some of the conclusions Ayer reaches are incredibly unique, and if they are in any way correct, offer a devastating critique to philosophical ethics as we have been approaching them this semester. Therefore, I felt it would be unfair to ignore these conclusions simply because I am not completely comfortable with the route Ayer takes in arriving at them. So, with adequate forewarning that my explanation of this route may be a bit rocky at times, let's begin. Ayer's critique of ethics begins with the observation that in order for a claim to have meaning, the claim must be provable. Now, in some ways, this is a really radical observation, but in others, it's actually pretty straightforward. Indeed, it seems obvious that the claim 2 + 2 = 4 means something because we can prove it. We can, for instance, put 2 apples next to another 2 apples and show that they add up to 4 apples, therefore establishing the meaning of the claim 2 + 2 = 4. Similarly, the claim apples are a solid means something because we can prove it. Indeed, as long as we know that a solid is something resistant to changes in shape and volume, we can prove that an apple is indeed a solid, thus establishing the meaning of the claim apples are solid. The thing is, Ayer continues, ethical claims are not provable in this way. It is probably easiest to see why Ayer thinks this by considering a specific example. So let's take the rather widely accepted ethical claim that murder is wrong and try to prove it. Okay, so if we're going to prove that murder is wrong, the first thing we have to do is figure out what both murder and wrong mean. Murder and wrong, in other words, must be defined before we can show that murder is characterized by wrongness. If you can't see why we have to do this, just think about proving the claim that apples are a solid. In order to prove this claim, in order to show that apples are characterized by solidity, we need to know what both apples and solids are. Similarly, in order to prove that murder is characterized by wrongness, we have to know what both murder and wrongness are. Well, murder on the one hand is pretty easy to define. I looked up the definition in the dictionary and was pretty pleased with murder being defined as the intentional and unlawful killing of one person by another. However, as Ayer points out, and as we have seen throughout the course of this semester, it is a bit tougher to define the concept wrong. Of course, we have also seen throughout this semester that all the various ethical systems do try to define wrong. Utilitarianism, for instance, proposes that wrong simply means decreasing happiness. Kantianism, on the other hand, argues that calling something wrong is saying that it is an action that can't be done by everyone at all places and at all times. Hume finally suggests that wrong expresses our disgust at something and thus means something close to, I don't like it. The problem with all these definitions, Ayer continues, is that they are not perfect. There is, in other words, room for debate about all of them. We could object, for instance, to utilitarianism's claim that wrong means decreasing happiness by pointing out that some things seem right, even though they decrease happiness. It seems right, for instance, to be honest with our friends, even though doing so will, at some times, decrease overall happiness in the world. We could object to Kantian's claim, on the other hand, the claim that wrong means doing something everyone else can't do, by pointing out that some actions seem right, even though it wouldn't be good if everyone else did them. It seems right, for instance, to occasionally lie, even though it wouldn't be good if everyone lied all the time. Finally, we could object to Hume's idea that wrong means not liking something by pointing out that there are certain things we believe to be right, even though we don't like them. Even though I sometimes don't like giving my money away to the poor, I realize that it is the right thing to do. Now, of course, none of these objections are unanswerable. Indeed, as we have seen this semester, philosophers are pretty good at coming up with answers to challenges. No doubt then, utilitarians, Kantians, and Hume could all formulate responses to these objections and make sense of why their definitions of wrong are not perfect. But whether or not they could in fact reply to these objections is ultimately irrelevant to Ayer. Indeed, Ayer merely wants to show that the definition of wrong, no matter which school of ethics that definition is given by, is always going to be debatable. Our definition of wrong, in other words, can never be as secure as a definition such as murder means the intentional and unlawful killing of one person by another. What Ayer wants us to see, in short, is that we do not and cannot know precisely what it means for something to be wrong. But, Ayer continues, if it is impossible for us to fully define wrong, then it is impossible for us to prove an ethical claim such as murder is wrong. If you're still having trouble seeing why this is so, just imagine trying to prove that apples are solid without knowing precisely what is meant by solid. It would be an impossible task. This, then, is why Ayer is convinced that it is impossible to prove ethical claims. Indeed, in order to prove ethical claims, we would have to have definitions of key ethical terms like right and wrong, definitions that we do not and cannot have. Therefore, concludes Ayer, since ethical claims are impossible to prove, then, according to his initial observation that in order for a claim to have meaning, the claim must be provable, ethical claims are meaningless. Okay, so let's assume that we have agreed with Ayer's argument up until this point, and thus accepted that ethical claims are meaningless. What then, we must ask, do we make of them? Or why then, we must ask, do we make them? Indeed, if claims concerning right and wrong and good and bad are ultimately meaningless, why are we making them all the time? Ayer's proposed answer to this question is that while ethical claims do not have meaning, we can still use them as a way of emotionally reacting to the things we encounter in ourselves and in the world. This, then, is why we make ethical claims, but still doesn't really help us understand what we are saying when we make them. What we are saying, in other words, when we say something like murder is wrong. In order to thus determine what we are saying when we say things like murder is wrong, insofar as this claim is nothing more than an emotional reaction, it will perhaps be helpful to first determine what we are not saying. Okay, so according to Ayer, when we say murder is wrong, we are not saying, as utilitarians would have it, murder decreases happiness. We are also not saying, as Kantians would have it, murder is not something everyone can do. We are not even saying, as Hume would argue, I really dislike murder. Indeed, according to Ayer, we can't be saying any of these things because each of them is in some way meaningful. Each of them, in other words, is saying something that is capable of being proved. But as we have seen, for Ayer, ethical claims are not meaningful. They are completely meaningless emotional reactions. Therefore, when we claim murder is wrong, all we are saying, according to Ayer, all we are doing is reacting to murder in a disapproving way. All we are thus saying is something like murder, boo. So then, according to Ayer, ethical claims are not really claims at all. They do not tell us anything about the world or ourselves that is in any way provable. Rather, ethical claims are a type of emotional outburst in reaction to the world around us. They are thus similar to other emotional outbursts, such as crying, laughing, or turning red in the face. As such, Ayer, since he reduces ethics to emotions, is appropriately called an emotivist. So what if Ayer is correct? If he is correct, then ethics can no longer be approached by philosophy. Indeed, if philosophy is concerned with determining the truth or falsehoods of claims about the world. But as emotional outbursts are incapable of being true or false, and as, according to Ayer,